Greg Poirier, and again I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. But looking to see if Greg, from your position as a sommelier and very knowledgeable about the industry, if you could help us understand or give us some insight of the wine industry, especially how you see the wine changing and all these relationships that we've been talking about, the practices and so on, as we move from family-owned to bigger business type of winemaking.
Well, thank you very much. It didn't take much to get an invitation and want to participate with this group today. So thank you for that opportunity, let alone come down and visit my daughter in D.C. So a double whammy, and my three sisters and cousins and everything. Thank you. This is also our first Crossroads event, so we're getting a lot of benefits here. I'm not in the industry full time. I'm a hotelier who got involved with wine lists and wine programs. Never worked on the floor as a sommelier, but developed wine lists after I took some courses, and just basically started geeking out because it's an easy thing to geek out on. We all have our passions. This one has become one over the years that's kind of becoming insatiable and a little out of control. But it's rooted in the sense of awe that I've gotten as I've learned more about it, that really speaks to what Father Placid has been describing to us, what Aimée and he represent. The story, the history, and how it interrelates to our lives, whether you drink wine or not, I think is a huge importance. And it's about being tuned into what you have, whether it's getting a crappy piece of land and trying to figure out something to grow on it, and it turned out the only thing would grow is vines, and then make something beautiful out of it. I mean, what a metaphor for life, right? And for people. But as my geekdom efforts in wine developed, I went and got a wine MBA. It's actually a legit wine, an MBA program in France that's about the global wine industry. And I went there with a purpose because although we have ABAs in the U.S., one could argue that these are no different than a zip code is to real estate. And some of them can be 45,000 square miles, and some of them can be a mile. And to connect those dots in a more transparent way to consumers, I and other colleagues think there's a gap, and we're trying to address that gap. So we formed this organization called the American Grand Cru Society with the intention to try to find vineyards that have taken the time to really get the right matches and see them mature to become what I would think is a more authentic product. So as much of the romance has absolutely captured my heart and a lot of my passion, a lot of my time, I will also say that we live in a huge consumer market that 5 companies control all distribution of wine. And what you have access to, there are many of these beautiful stories of such authentic wine, but they represent a very small amount of the labels that you can find because we're label-making businesses. And so I would say that what you're hearing and what you're feeling today does not get any more authentic in America. And we're never going to develop laws and regulations, nor necessarily do we want to, but to help either protect or highlight. And so we're trying to form a group that's going to do that through a nonprofit, a trade association nonprofit. So although I don't spend my full time doing it, that's what we're about. And I guess I'll just open with that one, kind of a business content about brands. There's maybe 2 million brands on the market in the U.S. No one really can tell for sure because you can just put one out there. You can have your own. You can get on the web and you can order fruit and make wine in your garage and put a brand on it tomorrow, and you get it from Napa. And there's vineyards in Virginia that get it from Washington. So it's an interesting thing, and I don't want to take away from the beauty of what it really represents, but there's a big difference between what I would say is an authentic wine and what these folks represent and what you can find in the marketplace. So it's worth seeking out. That's my opening salvo.
Great, thank you. This next question is going to be for all the panelists to respond to. Less than 2 weeks ago here in Washington, D.C., we had a wonderful visit from Pope Francis. And there were many messages I think everybody that followed the events could take away from it. But one that I think it was very clear is his insistence on the man's relationship with the earth. And as we're talking about winemaking and we're talking about terroirs and the earth, the question to the panel is, from the perspective of the vineyards, what kinds of things can we do to honor the earth and to preserve what we're doing and this tradition that we're talking about for future generations?
Okay, I'll field that one to start with. It's really hard, I think. There's a lot of terms out there being thrown around. It's a very popular term for sustainability. There's biodynamics, there's organic, there's sustainable viticulture, there's so some of these all have certificates, which is great. Just for instance, and not to take away from this program, but we were talking about being certified sustainable because at New Clairvaux and in my family's business, sustainability is really important. We are trying to preserve and pass to the next generation. These are ideals that are on the forefront because this is what our forefathers did, and we have been gifted these things. And so not only with the monastery, but also with my family. And so we talk about it a lot, and we really want to continue and gift the next generations these things that we've been so blessed with. But when I went to fill out the documentation, I downloaded a document and I hit the print button. And it printed and printed and printed and printed, and it was 150 pages long. And I thought, this just doesn't feel right. Where did this come from? And it's just, it's a funny thing to weed through. Yes, it looks good on a label, and yes, it sounds good, but is it really practical? Does it really mean something? It's really hard for a consumer to know the difference and to really know. I think if I were to suggest anything, it might be to delve a little bit deeper, get to know a brand, visit a place, ask them what they're doing. It's not easy. I wish there was an easier or a better answer, something, a neon sign glowing on a bottle that told you this was the one to buy because we are doing really good. I will say cork is a really an interesting thing with the monastery. When we decided on packaging, it was very simple. The cork industry, the problem with cork is sometimes you'll get corked wine and it's not the fault of the producer, it's not the fault of the cork company. Cork is a natural thing, and there's an organism that lives in cork that will cause cork taint. And it's just, they live together, and it's what you're going to run into every once in a while. It has forced the cork industry to get really good at trying to find these problems and get rid of them before they pass them on to the winery, because the winery started asking for better solutions, and so we came up with synthetic corks, we came up with screw caps, and those industries have been great because it caused competition and made the cork industry get better. But when we decided what closure we were going to use, the simple question came to, well, if we don't support the cork industry, then it doesn't support the forests. And and it's a renewable resource. Cork trees, you can take off the bark and you don't have to take out the tree to harvest off of that. And so we're a small company. We know our part is a small part, but even if it's a small part, we wanted to support it. And so that's why we chose our closure to be a cork closure. But we also respect the screw cap and the synthetics because that competition really helped make the cork industry even better. So there's a balance and a good and a bad with all of that.
I can only talk about what we've done for our orchards. We not only have a vineyard, but originally we have prune orchards and walnut orchards. When we began at the monastery, in 1955. And what we do for our own sustainability is that we decided some time ago, instead of burning the wood that we have cut, that we would just have them chipped so that we're not polluting the environment with carcinogens. Number two, our sense of how we do our water irrigation. We've gone into more micro sprinklers than initially just flood irrigation because we're wasting more water that way, and especially in drought-stricken California. That it doesn't look bad for to our neighbors that we're using more water than they are in that sense. And so we're always looking for ways in which we're also on like an easement of property, so that we have some of our property, we will not put it under cultivation, and we'll also say we'll never be for any type of development at all. Even if we have to move from the property, we have made no bones that we do not want this land developed. Part of it is also is the cultural heritage of the land as part of the Yanayahi, where the Indians had their burial grounds. So we do have, there's that going on. It was also Lassen's land grant. So there is a cultural history in the land going back to the 1840s and also prior to that. And so we want to preserve that as part of our own history and that going forward, not only as just a monastery, but for the sake of for the state of California. So for our own sense for sustainability is that we have to be good stewards of the land. And that is just simply, it has nothing to be political, religious, or anything. It's just good common sense.
I'll touch on sustainability a little bit from an economic spin, in that if you imagine you spend $25 for a bottle of good wine, and you try to imagine the months and months of labor in the field, the work to harvest it, the work to then produce it, then the cost of the bottles, there's a lot of love in a good bottle of wine, and a lot of effort. And you talk about sustainable, it also has to be a business sustainable function. And I have a lot of respect for Demeter's, efforts to, which is Rose, that's the Demeter, is the moon and the harvest and the biodynamic, which is a great movement because it's based on the health of earthworms, natural things in the soils and things like that. I think we've done a lot as consumers to drive that interest. The challenge, though, for the small businesses that are agricultural is that each one of these adds in just a new expense and doesn't necessarily generate a new benefit, considering, again, that there's 5 big mega companies that are working for, only profits and increased stock prices, and that's what they have to compete against. So anytime they have to pay, and let alone have resources to go through 150 pages on their own and be their own lawyer and accountant to manage that, it's really not that advantageous, and it doesn't necessarily mean they don't participate. So as an advocate for both consumers and I think the more authentic winemakers, we at least are not going to have anything that's ever charged, and we're going to have to find a model that works, that it gets sustainable revenue from anybody but the ones that grow and make the wine, because that is the opposite of what they're facing today.
I think he was saying the more expensive the wine, the better it's going to be.
Again, I'm going to ask this question to all the panelists. I started the introduction with the statement that wine is something that we share. I would go even further in saying that it seems to set itself apart from other alcoholic beverages, especially here in the U.S., in that wine is not consumed to get inebriated. It's usually it's shared as a family meal, shared with good company, and in many ways, I think, and we already started touching on it, wine becomes a metaphor for life, as I was mentioning in some of the quotes. Recently, my wife and I were in Virginia visiting some vineyards, and we were given a book called The Wine Dresser's Notebook, written by Judith Sotera. And she compares the lessons of winemaking to lessons of life. In her book, she walks through all the different stages of winemaking, talking about pruning and harvesting and bottling of a vineyard. And then she goes and compares each of those steps to life and how we might prune and harvest and bottle within our lives. So I thought that was a beautiful comparison, and I was just wondering how each of you might see that, and if you could share one of the lessons or metaphors that you've taken from the vineyard into your own lives.
This is sort of simple for monks.
Show you an easy one.
In that we all need to have pruning. Everything needs to be grown back. Whatever faults we think we've overcome, they come back another way. So we always have to have a diligence about our life. And this is what pruning and then tending the vines throughout the growing season means. And also getting after various diseases that pops up immediately, that it doesn't hurt the vine, it doesn't hurt the, at least the harvesting at the end. Because at least for us, we've had experiences where in the vineyard, and Aimée can say more about that, where we have lost entire varietals due to one fungus, or instead of picking all of it, we could only pick 10% of it, so that it took most of the harvest for like 3 years, picking 1 out of 10 grapes and then dumping the rest on the ground because it was worthless, and then saying, are we going to do this again and again for another year? And having to make this whole decision to regraft it and put another varietal in, and making sure that we don't do that again. So pruning, always cultivating and recultivating our own life is part of the deal. Whether you're a monk or a Christian, it makes no difference. But it is always being attentive to what springs up, even if we don't want to do it all the time.
Mine's kind of similar to Placid's here. For me, to make a great wine is about balance. You want balance in your vineyard, meaning you want your canopy to be balanced with the fruit zone. You need, the fruit has to be evenly spaced. I'm sure you guys have seen vineyards growing, and I'm sure you can see from a distance even, and especially if you come close to it, how meticulously they are cared for. They are trained onto wires or trained in some way. They are pruned in a very meticulous way. We only leave 2 buds, not 3, not 1, but 2. On every spur. Sometimes we have cane pruning. There's a lot of different methods, just like there's a lot of different types of ways to live life. But there's the same thing with grapes. They're trained different ways, they're pruned different ways, they're cultivated different ways. But in the end, it all comes down to balance. And the more balanced the grapes are, the better the fruit ends up being. I have an uncle that when I started in the wine industry, he was very famous for these funny quotes. And I'm going to share one with you because it just stuck with me. And he's a bit of a rough around the edges, kind of a country guy. And when I first started, he said, I got one piece of advice for you. Aimée, you can't make chicken salad out of chicken shit. And it's very, very true. You have to have very good fruit to make the best wine. And that was the cleanest one that he had. But Placid was talking about the experience of having some fruit that didn't work out for us. We ended up grafting over those vines, I think, after facing 5 seasons of being disappointed. And anyways, at some point you have to say, you know what, this variety's not working in this place, and we need to move on and try something different. So
I'm gonna maybe try it from a totally different perspective, but first is just an observation. You know, hearing Father Placid and listening to Aimée, you know, they make wine. We think about them as the result of their product. But all we hear about, we haven't heard anything about winemaking. We've heard about farming grapes and ripening them, getting them in balance, and all that balance, because that's what they're thinking, and the rest just happens when you do that right. And you know, when we think of our own life outputs, maybe, I don't know if anybody else has kind of got this other little voice going on listening to you guys, but I do. And so I thought I'd share that because I can't speak to that. But, you know, we need to constantly remind ourselves that it's not the little achievements and outputs. It's all the stuff that's in constant motion in our lives that we got to keep focused and in balance. Maybe you share that.
Thank you. The final question to the panel is to share what they think makes a great wine and what recommendations they would give us to more fully appreciate wine as we get ready to transition to the wine tasting portion.
I'll go first. I'll let everybody say last. Well, once you've qualified the authenticity of what you're about to experience and the anticipation is building, the best wine is the one in your hand.
I don't think I can top that one. Back mentioning about the winemaking, there's also a balance in winemaking. When the fruit arrives, this is where we would want to continue or perpetuate the balance. We crush it, we put it into tank, we taste, we check its pH, we check its TA, we check its bricks, we check its flavor components, and from there we decide, do we need to adjust and make this a little better balance? Because sometimes they don't come in perfect, because like for instance, this year in Napa, everything was very high in sugar, but very high in TA and low in pH, which is a great thing. It makes a fantastic wine, stunning color, very tasty because it's just got a lot of, the acidity just makes it very, I don't know, it just makes it pop more lively in the mouth. But then you have to kind of worry, did the tannins develop and and so we get a sense of where it is, and then to make it, we try to round it out where it's missing. And so we use techniques. We will maybe double the pump over if it doesn't have a lot of color. If it's got not enough acid, we might add in a little acid to build it into the structure of the wine from the very beginning. Lots of different ways in which we can help balance it better. And so I think the best wine is one that is in your hand, yes, and also one that's got some good balance to it.
I don't think I can top any of those. But the first one that when we began in the tasting room, we were told that the best wine for you is the one that you like. So it's going for one that you enjoy and you go back to, and also develop in your palate. But it's the one that you enjoy the most and the one that makes you most in tune with other people that you want to be with.